Rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice. Haven't seen that in a while. There are little ones keeping an eye on you, so behave. I remember distinctly that fall. It was the late fall of 1991. I was a junior. Fall sports had just ended. I was happened to be a basketball player, and so as they do every year after Thanksgiving break, they get everyone together and they basically just run them until they throw up. I mean, that was basically the jam. They just run you and run you and run you. And this particular year's tryouts, and we were about 50-50, about 50% juniors, 50% seniors, and most of us didn't do anything in the fall that would prepare us for this particular week of two-a-days, where basically what we did was run. That is true for everyone in that group except one person. One teammate, a guy I grew up with, was a neighbor actually, lived just down the street from my earliest years. We remember him. He was 1 year older than I was. He was one of our seniors. His name was Pete. And Peter was a cross-country runner. And cross-country is in the fall, which meant that when we got to tryouts for basketball and the rest of us were really struggling, Peter showed up just running circles around us. It was as if he wasn't working at all. And you could sort of see it in his face, right? He was light and easy. He might even on occasion have been smiling while he was running. And you could see he was kind of joking with the rest of us who were struggling to run like he ran. There's a drill that we ran called Sweet 16s. Anyone familiar with Sweet 16s? No, good for you. They are deadly. What Sweet 16s are is this. They start the clock at 1 minute, everyone lines up on the sidelines, and you've got 60 seconds to run across that court 16 times. Right? 60 seconds to run across the court back and forth 16 times. If everybody succeeds, then you go to 45 seconds and everyone runs it 12 times. 30 seconds 8 times, 15 seconds 4 times. Now you only progress to the next level if everybody makes it. So you can imagine the dynamic. Put yourself in the gym. There's great excitement, but we've also just heard the whistle for Sweet 16s. And everyone is lining up on the sideline. Peter down on the far end, he didn't like to make a show of his amazing running, so he was at the far end. And whistle blows, clock starts, we run, almost nobody makes it. Almost nobody makes it. So we have to do it again. And then we do it again. And then we do it again. Now, you can imagine that among the folks who are struggling, it is a quick pivot from a sense of being teammates to a sense of being enemies, right? We are no longer one. We're not even two anymore. It's not the ones making it. There's only one person who's making it. It's not even that. We are just at each other. We're at each other. And there's a couple of folks who are at each other who are historic leaders among the group from our junior high years. Many of you know those characters. They were the loudest in their nastiness. Not only because I think they thought they should be able to do this, but because they thought, well, the best way to get the team to do what I need them to do is to yell at them, right? Maybe even disparage them a little. Right? See if we can't get the ego working here a little bit to turn things up. And then there's Peter down on the far end. He's not even engaged. He's just laughing. He's actually kind of looking, I think, forward to the next time they blow the whistle. He's like, 16, 20, I don't care how many times we do this. Just happy to do it. I just love being out here running. Just love it. So we do it again. Still at 16. A couple of people on Peter's end start to manage to keep up with him. Doesn't say anything. They're just like, well, Peter's getting this done. I think the thing to do is to do what Peter's doing. Then the next time, a couple more people do it. Next time, a couple more people do it. Finally, after about 8 rounds of this, I kid you not, do the math in your head. We're hurting by this point. Everybody finally makes it. Everybody finally makes it. Now, this is a classic test, right? The coaches are putting us to a test. They want to see what's the general dynamic in the room. What's the general dynamic? What's the culture of this team? Who are the leaders in the room? And how do they lead? How do they lead? We had some among us who thought that the best way to lead was to diminish and, in fact, to sort of be against. So I'm going to be against. And then there's Peter. He's the guy who was always for us. He was for us. And he didn't have to give big speeches. He didn't have to grab people and offer specific words of encouragement. He could just be for us because he wasn't absolutely losing his mind and turning against us. Just in his body, he had done the work of figuring out how to show up and be for us. Right? And he runs all year so that he can do that. He doesn't take a season off. He's always on. He's always ready to be for us, not against us. Peter is still that guy. He's amazing. We hear a story this morning, prickly, it's a little prickly this morning, hearing from John the Baptist, who is not saying really anything awful here. He's just making a statement of fact. You brood of vipers. You brood of vipers. Statement of fact. Broods don't come from nowhere. Someone's got to give them life. We each have within us the capacity to give life. We're part of a brood. But we also have the venomous capacity to take life, to diminish, to divide, maybe even to kill. And those two realities are true inside each and every one of us. We are brood of vipers. We are brood of vipers. We have always been. We always will be. We have this immense power gifted to us by our Creator. The question is, what are we going to do with it? How are we going to show up? And what difference does it make? Now, we know from last week, because we get John the Baptist 2 weeks in a row, we know from last week that this conversation takes place in real time, in a real place. When John first shows up on the scene, we're told a little bit about who's in charge at the imperial level. We're told a little bit about who's in charge at the national level. We're told a little bit about who's in charge at the ecclesiastical level. Right? There's a setting here. And it's important to note that those settings are all external to us. So if you're a person who imagines that the gospel does not have practical, real-world, political, and ecclesiastical implications, you are fooling yourself, and you are at odds with John the Baptist. His proclamation first begins, this takes place in real time, in a real place, with real people in charge. And our job is to figure out, as people who bear the image of God within us and among us, how do we show up into that? Not how do we show up in a vacuum, not how do we tend our quiet little hearts in the privacy of our homes. How do we show up in this context that he just went to great pains to describe? Trust me, the evangelist will use as few words as possible. So the fact that they're there means that they matter. How are we going to show up in real time, in real places, with real people? And this week, John says, it's not about how you name yourself. To be quite honest, it's not even how you feel about yourself. It's not what you think about yourself, because you've been fooling yourselves. What we're interested in is new behavior. right? You're not going to think your way into this. You're not going to feel your way into this. I'm going to tell you, you need to do the new thing, and you will act your way into the new reality. And your head and your heart may catch up with that. If folks are familiar with addiction frameworks, there's an addiction to the status quo here. And it's going to take Herculean effort to change our behavior before we change our minds and our hearts. They will be last. So you'll note, Jesus spends a lot of time role modeling new behavior. In fact, up at the table, we don't say, think about this in remembrance of me, or feel this particular way in remembrance of me. Of the two things we're supposed to do on a regular basis, he says, do it. I'm not interested what you think, not interested what you feel. Do the thing. Do the new thing. Life in the kingdom is marked by different behavior. And you're going to learn all about that behavior when this new king shows up. This one who shows up in the actual flesh at Christmas, who spends an entire church year showing us what the new thing looks like. He's not asking us about our thinking or our feeling. He's interested in our doing. And we're preparing ourselves to see that as the one that God is sending. We might be sitting here waiting, hey, my hope is on someone who's going to tell me about my feelings. We might imagine our hope is for someone who's going to tell us everything's okay, that everything's great. You do you, I'll do me. That might be our hope, but that's not the Christian hope. The Christian hope is there's this king who's going to show up, whose life is marked by peace and justice and the actual physical liberation of real human beings in their bodies. That's the one who's going to do the thing that you are expected to do when you say yes to being a disciple of that Lord. This is very practical. It's very practical. And this week reminds us that it's also pretty easy. We overcomplicate it. That's what thinking and feeling does, right? It is a great defense mechanism, right? Let me just think about this for a sec. Better yet, why don't I send it to committee? Let me check with my therapist how I'm feeling about this. No. Do that stuff while you're doing the thing. There isn't an if-then. It's a now. It is always with God, a now. Do the thing. It's going to feel uncomfortable. It's going to force your body to show up in ways that you might not be accustomed to, and then reflect on the dissonance. That's what life in the kingdom is like. It is constantly disruptive and dissonant. And you are going to feel uncomfortable. And guess what? That's why most people have said no. The entire story of the gospel from Christmas on out, no thanks. Everyone says, maybe, but no. They'll say, yeah, I kind of like the idea, and then they show up, they get to know Jesus. No, I'm out. We need to understand that this is a remnant culture. Which is to say, it will always be a minority report because it's hard stuff and it's fundamentally easy. It's fundamentally easy. What we're asked to do, knowing that we have both the verdancy of the life-giving potential within us because we're part of a brood, and because we know that we bear venom, real venom within our bodies that kills real people. We hold those two things together. And the task for us is to figure out how to give life, how to be life givers. And we spend a whole life trying to figure out how to do that. It doesn't happen all at once. We don't say yes to Jesus and all of a sudden our worldview and our behavior is right. We have to say yes not only once a year at Christmas to this new life of God showing up within us. We have to say life every single day, every morning. And if you're like me, probably again at lunch, right? You will always be starting again. And that's life with God. There's humility with that. There's an assumption that I'm only doing as much as I can. I'm doing the hard work of reflecting on why I want to do this and why I know I'm told to do this, but I keep doing this other thing. All that sin stuff that we spend so much time talking about, it's that stuff. But sin doesn't make any sense if we're not stretching and aspiring to do the right thing. Right? Sin is the distance between our desire and the outcome. Today is, somewhat ironically, hearing what we just heard about ourselves, Gaudete Sunday. It's the Sunday of joy. It's the Sunday of rejoicing. And you might ask yourself, what's that about? What's to rejoice here? We've just heard a hard word. Why would we rejoice in that? Health begins when we've received, as I said a couple weeks ago, a clear diagnosis about ourselves. There's no prescription if we don't know what's wrong with us. We'll be chasing the wrong solution. But we know fundamentally that what's wrong with us is that we've got this tension between us. The ability to join God in giving life and bringing life forth in the world, and yet we've got this shadow part of us, right? This shadow part of us that's very interested in our own self-preservation. And because of that, that lives almost in constant fear or judgment, or that we isolate ourselves. And at Advent, on Gaudete Sunday, we get to rejoice in a couple realities, knowing this about ourselves. And here's the couple things that are true. A couple things that are true. For people of faith, I mean, not everybody has to believe this, but the Christian faith says, here's what's true. And what's true in the Christian faith is this. There's a God who is making this happen, right? There's a God of infinite and ultimate power who set all things in motion, who has a dream of where they will end. We talk about Alpha and Omega, that's what that's about, if that's new language to you. Where did we come from and where are we headed? That this is all in the heart and mind of God. And that because God made us free agents to say yes or no to what God's up to, God has to be kind of persuasive, not coercive. God has to say, how am I going to get you in on this? I can't force you to do it, but how am I going to get you in on what God's up to? Right? Because if yes to God is the answer we're looking for, no has to be a legitimate option. Right? Anyone who's ever loved here, could you imagine if your beloved didn't have an option? I mean, that wouldn't feel much like love if they were forced to love you. If they could, if they didn't get to say no thanks. So God is making this thing happen. It's happening around us all the time. And guess what? Here's the most interesting thing and challenging for the church to figure out, and we're just starting to imagine this being true. God's doing that stuff with or without the church. All right, are you catching my drift here? We are not the exclusive bearers of what God is up to in the world. God is way bigger than that, right? That's why we're Trinitarians. If it was just Jesus, you might say, well, church is pretty significant here. We're Trinitarians. The God who created all things, Christian and not Christian, ecclesiastical and not ecclesiastical. That God is doing this thing to bring the world to its ultimate kingdom vision. Wolves and sheep, milk and honey. The God of all things is doing that for all people. And our task is to figure out, well, how do we get on board with that? How do we get on board with that? In what ways are we being left behind? How many different ways in our own lives individually and as a community are we saying, no thanks, God, we're not interested in what you're up to? Happens all the time. And I want you to know, there's no judgment in that. There's no judgment in that. The kingdom makes significant demands of us. It is risky to say yes to what God is up to and to actually mean it. We can call ourselves Christians. Lots of people are doing it. There's a whole marketplace for it. If you haven't read Kristen Kolb-Dumay's Jesus and John Wayne, go and get it, because it is all about this. How the vast majority of American Christendom is in name only. And this John the Baptist says, nope, God can do that with rocks. What God's looking for is people who've given their actual lives to do the thing, which is to love, which is another way of saying, just be for each other. Just be for one another. Whatever flourishing looks like for each and every one of us, and we've got to define it for ourselves and figure out what that means in community, whatever flourishing looks like for us, be for that. Whether you've got doctrine or dogma attached to it or not. Be for the flourishing of one another. That's it. That's it. And that's a lot. That's a lot. And so we show up to Advent again this year, to hear the story again, to have an opportunity to recommit our hope to the veracity of God's promises, that if you say yes to these things, you can join in God's very own life, in the divine life of God. You can join by doing this and not that, doing this and not that, doing this and not that. And for those of us who are just hanging on to see if we can't sneak our way into heaven, this blows all that out of the water. That is of no concern. Eternity is now. If only you will join the divine life of the God of all things, who is bringing life from death, who is bringing the captive forth from captivity. If you join that God in fighting for life now and for the flourishing of each other, that is eternity, because God is eternal. And when you do what God does, you are already in heaven. Wow. That's the good news. There is no fear in that. There are no enemies in that. We are each invited. We are each responsible for our answer, yea or nay, maybe a little more this year. That is worthy of our rejoicing, even on this day when we find ourselves to be among the vipers. We know we too have the power of life within us, and that is what it's all about. So, I say, rejoice in the Lord always. And again and again and again may we say, rejoice. Amen.